Alright, we're up at my dad's today. We're doing some boxes. So I'm going to show you the way that I assemble NUC boxes. I buy them as deeps, snap them together with some staples, and then I cut them down into mediums, and then I use the leftovers for making feeders or whatever I need. I always seem to need that little leftover space, and I really like the mediums because I don't run foundation. It just seems to work better for me. But if you buy medium medium NUC boxes, they're almost as expensive as the deeps. So I just buy the deeps and then cut them down, and I get that extra bit to work stuff with. So it works really well. I'll show you. Let's put one together. Alright, so this is a NUC box. It hasn't been stapled together or anything yet, but it's just set up there on top of the table saw. And you'll see the frame rests right here, like that. So your frames sit in like that. The temptation is to just staple them together just as they sit. I don't do it that way, right? Although this one lines up pretty good, right? The tops, everything's the right size. But when you get the mill run stuff, the cheaper ones, a lot of times, you know, one will be shorter than the other, and it gets in problems. So what you actually want to do is, when I assemble them, I flip it over, right? So now that top edge is all even. And so if you got some size difference on your four pieces, you can take care of that when we run it through the saw. So, because we'll cut this edge up first, make that all true it up, so we got a nice flat side or flat bottom, and then we'll come through and cut our chunk off for to make it a medium. One thing I should mention is I put little marks roughly where the saw is going to go, and so when I'm stapling, I stay clear of that so I don't hit any of the staples with the saw. Alright, we got everything set up. I moved the camera a little bit. One thing is, for your stapler, I use 1.5" staples, so I know that I get them, you know, at least halfway in each piece of wood, because we got 3/4 inch wood. I just buy the cheap ones, you know, from your big box store. They're good enough, right? And I also use a mobile compressor setup that if you guys want to see that in the future, I'd be happy to show it to you. So I always like to staple like this, right? So the staple runs up and down and not across, right? If it's across, there's a good chance that the water will hit it and stop there. So I'm giving the water not as big of a profile. So we'll just snap two here on one side of the line, and then I'll come here and I'll snap a little more. And I'll come over to the other side. Make sure we stay away from our line. And one thing, it's bowed out a little bit here, and so I'm gonna wait to do those until I can get this other side secured a little bit. And if you're worried about keeping it square, that's the nice thing about not gluing, is don't worry about it, right? Because you can always tweak it a little bit. Put through from this one. That one's down okay. This will force that down a little bit. And an extra staple or two never hurt anybody. So let's put that one down. Alright. Now we've got them stapled this way, but we want to cross staple so that it really locks them in place. And again, make sure we stay away from the line we marked. Kind of give it, we're going to angle down in a little bit because we don't have, stay away from our frame rest here. Alright. Here's our mark, so we'll stay away from that. quick once over, make sure we're good, that none of our staples are poking out, because then we got to go back in and clean those up. The staples are relatively cheap, so if you got a few extra in there, it's not going to hurt anything. Sorry about the compressor noise, right? So now all of our tops are nice and even, and that's what we want for the next step. Alright, so we've got our box stapled together. The next thing we want to do is we want to true up the bottom, right? I mean, if it's real flat and you want to leave it, you can, but I always just run them through. That way I end up with the leftovers always the same size. Our fence is set just about 9.5. It's actually a 1/16 over, but you know, 9.5 is good. It'll vary depending on who you get your boxes from, your saw, what, you know, stuff like that. This one's actually my dad's saw. It's pretty nice. It's a rigid. Does real well. I can't complain. I get to borrow it for free, and he gets a little honey out of the deal. So let's fire it up, and we'll run it through, and we'll square up that bottom. Alright, so now our bottom is nice and flat. We're parallel to the top, which when we set it up to staple, we used the bed of the table saw for a nice flat surface, and so we should have a nice square box. You can take a square and put it in there, and if it's off a little bit, you just, you know, squeeze the corners until you get it back into perfectly square. I don't normally bother, only because, you know, they're usually not off that much. So, all right, now that we've got that, we have to cut off our leftover section, right, to make it a medium. So we have that to work with later. Let me reset the saw, and I'll be right back. All right, so I moved over the fence. We are at about 6 7/8. That's where I keep mine at. Actually, it's just a hair under that, but it's close enough. 6 7/8 for me. So the mediums sit in there nice, and I got a little bit of room. Sometimes I find that there's a little bit too much room on the bottom of the frames, and that they want to build some burr comb between the bottom of the frames and the top of the next frames. I'm okay with that, right? So that way, if something happens to the box, I can always just trim a little bit off the bottom of it and still have room to spare. So it's one of those small inconveniences. But all right. Oh, and for those people that are thinking, "Oh, where's your safety guard?" You're absolutely right. You need to know what you're doing if you're going to run without a safety guard. It is dangerous. If you've never done any woodworking before, you probably don't want to do this, right? But if you're doing beekeeping, odds are you've done some woodworking, you'll be fine. So if you're worried about it, don't follow these instructions, right? This is just how I do it. Putting it out there. If people want to get something out of it, do it. I'm not telling you to follow it. So, all right, let's fire it back up. And again, we're going to put where the frames are up against the rest, like we did last time. Alright, we have our leftover piece that we use for making feeders or whatever. We have our our medium frame drops in, right? Got a little bit room in the top. The top is even. Got a little bit, you know, actually we could bring that down a little bit. That might be a hair too much. I think we'll bring it in a little bit more on the next one. A little bit too much room underneath. So that 6 7/8 might be a hair too much. Probably tighten that up another 1/8. Just so that kind of cut down our burr comb, but at the same time, you know, make sure we got enough on the bottom to true that back up if we have to. So that's how I make my NUC boxes. Right. Tip number 1 is when you're stapling in from the side, make sure you're down far enough. Otherwise you end up with staples running through your frame rest. So I'll have to get those out of there with the pliers or something, and it'll just be a little hole there. But yeah, just one of those things to keep in mind when you're doing it is just start your cross stapling down far enough that you're not going to run into the frame rest.